They designed and built their airplane at their bicycle shop in their hometown, Dayton, Ohio. Then, on December 17, 1903, beginning at 10:35 a.m., Wilbur and Orville Wright flew their airplane over the sandhills at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They picked Kitty Hawk because the National Weather Service said that consistent winds there would give them their very best chance for success. Over 90 minutes, they flew 4 times that day. The first flight was 12 seconds, 120 feet in the air. The fourth flight was 59 seconds, 852 feet in the air. That morning, the Wrights changed the history of the world. Immediately, plane designers, especially in the United States, France, Britain, Germany, and Italy, started creating their own planes that would go higher and faster than on that morning at Kitty Hawk. Just a dozen years after the Wrights' first flights, planes from many countries flew combat against each other in what is called the Great War, World War I. "20 years later, World War II became the most destructive war ever, then or now, but for 4 years, beginning in 1914, the Great War was devastating. 16 million people died, and the airplane revolutionized warfare. The war started in Europe. The United States entered the war a few years later and sent its first airplane to France in 1917. It was the DH-4, a bomber reconnaissance plane named after its original British designer, Geoffrey de Havilland. More than 1,200 DH-4s arrived in France, and nearly 700 of them performed target surveillance, intelligence gathering, and bombed German positions on the ground. This was not a glamorous flying. While the famous Rickenbacker, Richthofen, and other pilots were ace dogfighters for the United States and Germany, DH-4 crews were freezing in their open cockpits, crashing, being shot down, breaking down, and at times even running into their own bombs that were headed toward the ground. Plane and crew losses were heavy. Many medals of honor were presented to DH-4 crews for their courage and their patriotism. They had a significant effect on the outcome of the war. After the war, the DH-4 became the principal airplane to start airmail service in 1918 in the United States. The DH-4 was the cornerstone for commercial aviation in America. Please welcome, thank you. Please welcome our DH-4 and our O2A team, and I'll introduce them in a moment.
You're next.
Gents are sitting down. And so on your far right, Dorian Walker is the DH-4 guy. The two guys in the middle, John Foote, Gary Wycliffe, are his engineer restorer team. And immediately on my left, is Bob Schaefer, and he is a commercial pilot and has a vast background with the U.S. Coast Guard, and he is the owner of this airplane right here, which we're going to talk about later. Gentlemen, welcome to Warbirds.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Dorian, start us off. 1917 airplane, and this one is how many? Is this flying?
Not yet. It is about to start its test flying. We're aiming September right now.
Is there a DH-4 flying anywhere in the world?
There's one other DH-4, David, flying. It's in New Zealand.
Tell us about this airplane. What's your passion about old airplanes, this and your Jenny?
Well, our team reconstructed a 1917 Curtiss Jenny. And we did it because one day we had a pile of parts in a hangar, and there was some young people that came in to look at this. And I was told that they were really interested, and I couldn't understand why, because it's just like a beached whale, didn't look like an airplane or anything like that. And so we started we did 3 groups of kids, and I said, well, we must have gotten all the geeks, because they seem to be really interested in this and not looking on their cell phone or looking at the airplanes in the airport where they're doing it. And so the light bulb went on to all of us that are working on this thing that this is going to be the foundation of what we become Friends of Jenny, and flying the Jenny for 4 flying seasons across America, introducing to America the young and the old of what these beautiful aircraft look like in the sky. So Jenny, we've flown to 14 states. We're the only one in the world to fly cross country. We were asked 2 main questions at air shows. One is, how did it get here if they didn't see it fly in? And the second was, where did the guns go? And we said, well, the Jenny didn't have guns. It was a trainer. We're all very proud Americans, our whole team, and a lot of veterans in our group. And so we had, about 3 years ago, we had the centennial, the World War I centennial, out on the horizon. And so at one of our board meetings, we said, what would happen if we could tell the entire American early military history? Show the training, the mass-produced Jenny trainer, and then America's first warplane, the DH-4. And the group said, let's do it, if we can find an original airframe. So it took us a little while, and we did.
Where did you find it?
We found it up in Washington State, and it's the last known available airframe, original airframe. And so we acquired it. We tried a fundraiser, and a lot of interest, but not enough funds. So a whole group of us here took out a loan, because we said this is really important. And so we borrowed the money to start the production.
You borrowed the money personally to do this?
A group of us did, yes.
Oh.
It's an important story to tell, because it not only salutes those aviators that so proudly answered the call 100 years ago, but as being Warbird number 1, it tells the story of all aviators, men and women, all colors, that have stepped into the cockpits to defend freedom across the world. And we think this airplane represents that.
John, you're heavy into caring about young people and the education part of all this. What do you do to get this information to young people so they can digest it and get excited about it?
Well, I personally think that what's missing in aviation is what I call fingers through the fence. We don't have enough kids, enough young people looking through the fence, dreaming of flying. So what we're doing currently, and we had a whole bunch of high school students help on the DH-4, is an internship program. We're working with 3 local high schools in South Central Tennessee, and even a couple of homeschool families, coming out once a week to help work on the airplanes, learning about the history, learning about the methods that were used, and just trying to get them excited about aviation and about the history of that. So it's hands-on. I mean, they're putting their hands on the airplanes that's 100 years old. It's the history for them. And then that's actually filtered down. Now we have some of the school administrators and some of the history teachers interested in what they're doing and what the students are doing. So Dorian, in this whole education process, so what are you teaching about the history of the DH-4 and about this model airplane and what those planes did in 1917, 18?
Well, one of the things that kids find most fascinating is on these early airplanes, all of the flying controls are on the exterior. So they go and fly a Cessna 150 or 172, and they come and look at this, and they realize this is how aviation began. They can see how the cables work. They can see how the elevator works, how all the ailerons work. And that's sort of the first thing. I think they're really just enamored with the fact that there's so many wires, they're big, they're kind of cumbersome, and they fly so slow. I mean, there's nothing like, we haven't had this in the air, but I tell you, there's nothing like seeing a Jenny in the air. It is a piece of poetry. And then you realize this also represents a big educational part of it. It's not just about aviation. It's about American ingenuity, entrepreneurship, hard work, all those things that we like to think America is the best at.
Right. Thinking, go back to the history of this airplane, we heard a little bit about it in the video, but talk about what the plane actually did in the air over France and Germany.
Well, you know, when we finally got into the war in 1917, there was no Air Force to mention. There was one Aero Squadron. They had a bunch of unserviceable, no combat airplanes at all, so a few training airplanes. Congress, it's kind of interesting, Congress appropriated the largest amount of money in the history of the United States to that date to build an Air Force, $640 million. Wow. And with that, I said, let's get going. But building these airplanes, even on an assembly line, was not an easy thing at all. So the first thing that the Warbird did is they put together a committee, as most government agencies do, and they sent them to France and England to say, we don't have time to design an airplane. Let's find an airplane we can adapt to American production. So they looked at the French, they looked at the British, and they found that the de Havilland DH-4, which was very successful for the Royal Flying Corps, was something that they thought would adapt itself pretty well to American production. So that's the one that they acquired. They brought it back, and lo and behold, they found out to begin with, the British don't use inches and feet. So the first roadblock to the production of America's warplane was in front of them. So they began to make, find ways around that. So when they built them, they got an order, a lot of money, and no engines, by the way. That's another whole story, which Gary can really help you address. But they needed to build an airframe and do it quickly. So they adapted the DH-4. They got an order for a total of about, initially, 4,400 of them. They're from 3 aircraft manufacturers. Dayton Wright did most of them. They did about a little over 3,000. And then Standard Aircraft Company did about 200. And then Body by Fisher did about 800, I think. So of those, about 1,200, as you mentioned in your piece, were sent to France. I think 1,284, actually. So they were then put together, because they're shipped in pieces, and then they were farmed out to 13 Army Air Service squadrons. 5 of those were bomber squadrons. The others were observation squadrons. And they went to 4 Marine Navy squadrons as well, to be used as principally as bombers. And those were the ones that were in Belgium, most of them. So they farmed out to these squadrons. Generally 16 airplanes was in the squadron. And they began the task of using the sky to defend democracy.
And this was only, 13, 14 years after the Wrights flew.
Absolutely.
And yet
absolutely.
the Italians, the Germans, the Brits especially, and the French were building airplanes.
Yep. Well, think about this. On the bomber version of this, it could initially carry 10 bombs, 5 25-pound bombs under each wing. So as anyone that's flown bombers or tested this, you know that when you lose that weight, your aircraft's going to suddenly, it's lurch, yeah. So what they developed, another innovation that this airplane's responsible for, they developed a stabilizer that had a trim. There's a big wheel in the pilot's cockpit, looks like a nautical wheel, and there's a worm gear that connects to the worm gear back in the vertical post in the tail fin, and it would allow you to move on a set of hinges the back of the stabilizer up or down, depending upon how you needed to adjust it. So there was an innovation that was started on this aircraft that changed the way certain aspects of aviation are done today.
Gary, he mentioned about the engine. Talk about the original engines and about what this engine is and where did it come from?
This engine basically was designed from scratch to power this aircraft. There's 2 gentlemen was in a motel room in Washington, D.C., and I think in a series of 10 days to 2 weeks.
This is the original engine?
This engine here.
Oh, this
Yeah,
one.
This one, yeah. They laid out and designed this engine, and then they started making the molds and the dies to put this engine together. And this engine has been used in, not only this aircraft, but when they got through with flying here, they also used these in a lot of boats, and they've put into power units for various applications. The surplus was.
And how much power does this have? How many?
This is 400 horsepower at 1,650 RPM.
Are there any original engines from DH-4s?
This is an original, but
It
it's
is?
been completely rebuilt. Yes, there's originals, but they're hard to find. But this is an original engine.
John, what is your role, besides the education aspect, in restoring this airplane?
The easiest way to explain that is I get to make it look good. I do the fabric covering, I do the assembly, rigging, the painting, those kinds of things.
Right. Dorian?
By
Yeah,
the way,
go ahead.
And you have to ask John about rigging, because he is, in my opinion, I've flown the Jenny for 4 years. From the test flight on, I mean, the rigging and the things that he's responsible, because I was looking, when our team was looking for someone to do that, I mean, there's, in the Jenny alone, and here there's even greater cable, there's a mile of cable. And if you don't have your stagger correct, if you don't have your incidence correct, if you don't have the tension correct, just think of all the things that can go wrong. And this guy's like a piano tuner. I don't know where he learned it, what he drank or what pill he took, but I'll fly anything he rigs.
Hey, speaking of that, you mentioned first flights, and we know that first flights are a really big deal of an airplane, because who knows? I mean, even with computers, whether it's going to do what it's supposed to do when it takes off. And Edwards Air Force Base, we all know, has lost a lot of pilots over the years, fewer of late, of course, because of computers. But back to slipsticks, slide rules. How many of you here have never heard of a slide rule? Well, there's one. That's okay. But at any rate, first flight's a big deal. What was your first flight in the Jenny like, and how nerve-generating was it?
Well, Jennies have a reputation of vibrating. I didn't know if it was me or the plane that was vibrating more. It was, and these guys were there in that first flight. As anything, you're saying, will this thing fly? And it turns out where we were doing our flight testing was in a small runway that John had created between two taxiways and a small airport in Kentucky. At one end of the runway was a pond, and I've seen the movie The Great Waldo Pepper, and I know how Axel landed in the palm. So I was thinking about, well, will I land in the pond, or should I bring a life preserver with me? And then the other end, it sits on a plateau, is the mountain. So I had two choices of getting it off the ground and then of getting it back on the ground. It was either the pond or the mountain, but somehow luck was with us. And
so what was it like for you two on the ground watching what he just described?
Nervous. You watch it take off and it started to settle, and you think, oh my goodness. And then it takes off, then a few passes and it gets on the ground, then you start to breathe again.
So does it fly better now than the Jenny than it did then?
well, the Jenny has no aerodynamic stability, so you're constantly flying it, and you just have to get used to that. The one thing I did learn was I wasn't strong enough to fly the Jenny. I made it around the pattern 3 times, and they probably thought, oh, he's coming down earlier, or I think it'd stay up longer. No, it's because I couldn't hold the stick any longer. And you have to realize these, as much as I like to think of myself as 18 or 19 or 20, or wish I could be there, like some other people here would probably say the same thing, is that they were built for young, athletic men. And strength wasn't a problem. They didn't have trim tabs originally, then they were added. And so the first thing I did, once I got safely on the ground, I said, I need to begin a program that I continue today. I do 50 push-ups every day to arm, just so that you've got the strength if you need it. We have since we do a lot of cross-country flying, and I've got a really long cross-country over mountains coming up here in a few weeks, is that we have installed a trim tab in the John has, so we can trim it up a bit in the elevator.
push-up getting in shapes make you sound like Sean D. Tucker every day.
We don't do anything like Sean D. Tucker does. We're slow and
Well,
slow.
what altitude, if you're going over the Rockies?
No, we're going to go over the Appalachians. That's
so-
famous. The Suicide Alley. That's what the old male pilots called it. Yeah, because they got
And
lost.
how much altitude?
Well, we'll try to get as high as we can, at least 1,000 feet over the mountains. You have to ask Gary. He was flying with me down to Maxwell, and we hit some of the mountains. And how are those downdrafts anyway?
Gary, what was it like?
Where's the airplane going? The wing drops, lose a couple hundred feet, and when you're flying at 700 or 800 feet, okay, you get it back, but she's got a mind of her own. You don't ever let go of her.
How effective was the plane in Europe in World War I?
This airplane?
Yeah.
Well, this airplane was really, I'm told by the historians that I've talked to, even though it came into the war late, it really accomplished a lot. It was one of the fastest airplanes, as big and bulky as this. You say, oh, Fokkers and Albatrosses, who you'll see this posed with, make sure you go over the World War I Aviation after this. They'll just have their field day with it. They didn't. This was faster than those airplanes. Right. At that time, it was 125 miles an hour. And so there were certainly some of the later German planes that could keep up with it, but it really could get there. And because of the armament, we of course, the British only put one gun on each, on the front and the back, and us being Americans, we have to be more aggressive and better. So we put two guns. So we got two 30 caliber guns, Lewis guns on the rear, and two Marlins for the pilot in the front.
So, all in all, what do you expect this plane to perform as, and what are you going to do with it once you get it up in the air?
Well, we built this really for one reason alone, and that's to pay tribute to American military aviation. So we're looking at the possibility of getting it to France. They're interested in it. This is depicting the 50th Aero Squadron, the colors on this airplane, and they were one of the squadrons that won not won, but were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it was number 6 that did it, and they were looking for the Lost Battalion, which many people have heard, and there's been books and things written. And these pilots had been shot at, and their plane, which was number 2, not number 6, barely made it back to the airfield. But they thought they found the battalion, so they talked to their CO and said, "We got to go again." Weather was bad, late afternoon. They climbed back in. Their last flight. Wow. Germans decimated them. They flew low. They found the battalion, and they were dropping supplies to them, which was one of the first air-to-ground supply missions, another first of this airplane. Wow. So our notion is to try to tell as many people as we can this story, and that, again, it represents the terrific courage that the men and women of America have exhibited every time they've climbed into any kind of a cockpit to defend liberty.
So when you fly, and when, September, you hope?
Our test flight, that's when we're hoping to
test flight in September?
Yeah. There's interest in getting it to Europe to fly that mission. It was based out of Remacourt on October 6th, that mission. And the town and the French officials are working hard. If anybody knows anybody at the Pentagon level that would like to help find us a C-5, or we'd even go with a C-130 to take it over. We could get it there. And they'd like for us to fly that mission. The original field is as it was 100 years ago.
Really?
It's owned by the mayor of the town, and they're crazy about trying to get this thing back. And then, of course, it'd be great to be there to celebrate the armistice as well.
So when you first fly this, though, in Kentucky, yes?
Tennessee.
Tennessee,
Winchester, Tennessee.
Will you publicize that ahead of time, or you're going to do it pretty much on the hush-hush?
Well, we were thinking about lining up, working with Sofa Factory and lining up sofas all along the runway and selling seats, If nothing else, it'll at least be fun, that first flight.
And pay off part of the debt.
Maybe.
Right. So let's get a little more modern here. Bob, tell us about this airplane.
Well, the Skymaster, built by Cessna, is a military adaptation of a civilian airplane. During the Vietnam War, the Air Force was using the O-1 as an observation airplane. The O-1 was a two-seat single-engine airplane that really was
Cessna.
not that much a Cessna, not that much different than a Piper Cub. It had grown bigger and more complex, of course, but still relatively slow, with only one engine. And its job was to go out and find the enemy and communicate that location to the attack aircraft and artillery units and crews on the ground to be able to interact.
So
with
they
the
were
enemy.
forward air controllers.
They were forward air controllers. They were like the conductor of the orchestra of battle. They didn't play any of the instruments, if you will, but they told everybody else where to go and when. So the Air Force needed something faster, more survivable, and although what they wanted later turned into the OV-10 Bronco, it took a long time to design an airplane from a clean sheet of paper. They needed something now. So they turned to Cessna, and Cessna said, hey, we have this new civilian business airplane that we designed to compete with Piper's Seneca. Maybe you guys would be interested in it. So
And about what year was this?
this was in about 1967, 1966, 67. So the Air Force, for a couple of weeks, tried one of these civilian airplanes. They tried flying it. They, hey, this is pretty neat. And they let's try it some more. So they set up a real evaluation of the Cessna Skymaster business airplane. And they said, yeah, we like this thing. We want to buy a bunch of them. But Cessna, we need you to make some changes. So they made a list of the things they wanted different. We want different systems in it. We want different radios. We want the ability to mount ordnance weapons on the aircraft. We need some more windows. We need this thing and that thing. They made a whole list of things. And Cessna said, sure,
Based on what the
Based on the-
01 pilots had
Yes.
told them they needed.
Exactly, based on the mission requirements. So Cessna said, sure, we can do that. And the Air Force said, great, we'll call it the O2A. And Cessna set about building them. And this is an example of an O2A designed as a combat aircraft, a forward air control aircraft. It has hard points, pylons under the wings that can carry offensive weaponry. Usually those were marking rockets, and the forward air controller at the enemy or a location that he wanted to point out to the fast-moving attack aircraft. He'd fire off a marking rocket, and then he had a suite of radios. So he could talk to the attack aircraft, he could talk to naval artillery, Army artillery, whomever he needed to talk to, and he'd tell them to use his puff of smoke as a reference, hit my smoke, or hit 100 yards north or west of it, as the case may be, to direct their weapons onto target. So that was the role of the O2A. It was at the very point of the spear, finding the enemy, marking their location, and directing iron onto the target. And then after, it stuck around and assessed the damage that had been done, and it could photograph that damage, and also could be in charge of combat search and rescue should any other aircraft be down. He could direct the search and rescue activities. So that's, in a nutshell, what the O2A did.
Just how dangerous was that forward air controller flying? Low altitude?
Very.
Low altitude,
word.
low speed.
And armed with little more than a microphone and maybe a pistol in your holster. Yeah, that was because the O2A didn't carry really offensive armament.
Yeah.
The rockets were used for marking enemy locations. Some models, sometimes they carried minigun pods, but the miniguns could be used while on a
Strafing
rocket
run?
market. Yeah, they could be used for strafing. They weren't really very effective. And they were used mostly just to make the bad guys keep their head down while you're marking their location. But the bad guys learned pretty quickly to keep their head down because they didn't want to be found by the O2. So not being completely dumb, they'd keep a low profile. And once the O2 had gone by, like whack-a-mole, they'd pop up then and start shooting at the back of the O2. So O2 pilots learned pretty quickly to keep moving, to keep maneuvering all the time, and to look behind them because that's probably where the enemy was.
Right.
So then there was another variant of the O2 called the O2B. The Air Force couldn't get the O2A quite fast enough, so they actually went to Cessna and took some civilian 337s off the assembly line. They went to some dealers and bought some back, and they actually went to some private owners who had just taken delivery of their nice new airplanes and said, hey, we'll buy them back from you. They put Air Force paint jobs on them, and they put some extra radios in them. And those became the O-2B, which is pretty much a standard civilian airplane with an Air Force paint job. And those were used for liaison activity, and they were also used for psychological warfare. They were equipped with a leaflet dispensing chute that allowed leaflets to be dispersed out of the airplane. They carried them below the rear propeller so that the leaflets wouldn't get turned into confetti going through the rear propeller. So they could be used for psychological warfare that way. And they also had a loudspeaker built into the side. You'd take the baggage compartment door off and put a big loudspeaker and amplifier in there so they could broadcast messages to the enemy locations. So psychological warfare, they were sometimes called the BS bombers, and you can fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
There's one story regarding that. How many of you know about Bud Anderson? P-51 Mustang pilot. He's the ranking living American ace right now. When he finished his test flight career, after he came back from Europe, he was a test pilot for many, many years at Wright Field and Edwards Air Force Base. And Bud had 2 years left in his career. And he was offered the chance to go back to the Pentagon, probably get his first star as a brigadier general, and sit at a desk for his last 2 years as an officer in the Air Force. He refused to do that. There was an opening for a wing commander in Vietnam, and he volunteered and became a fighter bomber wing commander in Vietnam or in the Philippines, flying missions over Vietnam. His son Jim was then an Air Force pilot flying this airplane. And against regulation, maybe I shouldn't tell this, I don't know.
Go ahead.
Huh? Go ahead. Sam said it's okay. Good. So anyway, Bud flew over to Vietnam from Clark Field one day and got, contrary to regulations, in the O-2A with his son. They were never supposed to fly together. And by the way, they did not tell Mom and Bud's wife that they were doing this. And anyway, Bud went on a mission and was throwing pamphlets out of an O-2A as a wing commander. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon. I'll see if I can get him to tell it, but don't count on it. I don't think he will. So when you hear this talk about what it took to get that airplane in the air, and you talk about all these frequencies and radios and all this great stuff, what goes through your mind thinking back to what they dealt with?
Well, think of the remarkable advances in technology from the time of this airplane to the time of this airplane to what we have today. Wow, that's just astonishing. So I applaud you fellows for telling the story of this, because it's so important that not just young people, but some people who aren't very young anymore know that and can appreciate that. That's one of the reasons my lovely bride and I like to take this airplane around to air shows, is to tell the story of the brave men who went to war in this airplane. Let's face it, a painted over, converted civilian business plane that was put into uniform and pressed into service.
Some might suggest go figure.
Yeah. And so many of them didn't come back.
Yeah.
There were a little over 500 of these produced between 1967 and 1970 for the Air Force. Just under 200 of them were
Right.
to all causes. So a lot of brave men went to battle in this airplane and didn't come back. So it's very sobering. There are about 37 of them on the FAA registry today. And whether those are all airworthy or not is unknown, but that's how many are still registered. So not a lot
Damon,
left.
when did you get the bug to get into old airplanes and become such a passion? What was the trigger?
I think probably like a lot of people, when I was a kid, My father joined the Army Air Corps, and so I grew up in that what later became an Air Force family. And my parents, told me about he was at Langley Field, and going up on the berm and looking and seeing those airplanes taking off and pointing to them. I think from then on, I mean, when I was a kid, for some reason I started with this. I don't know why. I guess I was just intrigued by they looked interesting and complicated, and then of course you got all the great stories of the day that you would hear about the Red Baron and about Eddie Rickenbacker and all these British heroes, and the great risks that they took in these little paper-thin airplanes. I think that's probably what got me going. And then of course I love history because I do believe, and apply what you do, Bob, and the notion is that history is the foundation we build a better future on. And we all believe in that. And the more we can share it with people, the better, hopefully, we'll have a future for.
And by the way, Damien, in his day job, is an award-winning documentary maker and historian. And so you're putting the two passions together.
You betcha.
So, Gary, when did you get hooked on engines, among other things? Are you a vet?
No, I'm not. But as a kid, I used to put little balsa wood model airplanes together every night. And as far as the engines, I started working on the engines when I was about 8 years old.
Really?
And then I had a diesel business I, quote, was supposed to retire from. And then when they started a Jenny project, I went out and volunteered to remove a few bolts. And that was, 6 years ago? So, and you meet a lot of nice people at these events. And,
did you get hooked or did you get trapped?
Yeah. Yeah, you can say both.
John, what about you? When you a teacher? You sound like a teacher.
Yeah, I've taught at A&P schools, and currently I have a flight school and a maintenance training center. We train a lot of pilots and mechanics for mission service. So I got in the older airplanes mainly because of the challenge, because it's so challenging. You're going back in time to an era where aerodynamics is in its infancy, but it's a challenge to do it because you're not just parts changing. You're not just, you have to really understand what's going on in the airplane, especially for the rigging of the airplane. You get a really good understanding of what's going on. So I like it for the challenge, the reward with the students. We have one of our A&P students sitting over there, Lissa. Hi, Lissa. And she's about halfway through our A&P program. Great. And to see a student's light, to see the light come on for them when the understanding of something like this transfers over to the modern day airplanes. And so for me, getting hooked on this, I tell people a lot of times, if you're a fan of The Matrix, sometimes I wish I would have taken the blue pill. But it's the challenge and the reward of seeing a pile of parts end up looking like this.
Like that. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. So this concludes this part of our program. Sam Bass, who is about to stand up, maybe, watch. He did. He stood up and dropped his microphone. Oh, that was good, Sam.
I forgot it was there.
Sam Bass is an extraordinary aviator, over 35,000 pilot hours that he has logged. And Sam is going to speak with Damien and Bob here and answer your questions about these two airplanes. Gentlemen, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
The first thing I would like to ask you, Damien, is you said that this was a pile of parts, or actually a puzzle, I guess, when you got it. Where'd you get the plans to put it together?
That's top secret, and I would have to kill you if I let you know.
Did plans actually exist
yes,
for it?
That's an excellent question. The government, in 1950 whatever, at Wright, issued a contract to photograph a whole series of the old plans. So they're on microfilm.
Was that a reverse engineering, or you could just actually pull it off?
Well, we used them, but every time we got into trouble, it was generally because of the plans.
Did you alter any of it to make it a little bit safer, or as far as materials?
We like to live on the edge.
Okay. Let me ask you about the engine. The engine it was used, I guess, for something else, and you guys rebuilt it, or you rebuilt it, Gary, is that correct?
Well, we had a gentleman in Idaho rebuild it. I went out for a while and helped him to learn about the engine. But yeah, it's, Liberty V12, 400 horsepower, I think 1,650 cubic inches, which it's a kind of a unique, simple engine, but yet it's complicated. To reduce its size, they use one journal to run 2 cylinders, so it's not offset, so it makes it more compact. 2 carburetors, 2 distributor systems on it. It's a dry sump system. It's really a simple engine, but probably until it breaks.
Well, Packard was partially responsible for the design of this engine, right?
There was, let's see, Packard.
Scott Hall.
Oh, excuse
Go
yeah.
ahead, no, he's telling me what to do.
Packard, Lincoln, Buick, Cadillac, Ford, and then there was a Marmon and another one that actually produced the Liberty engine, because one manufacturer couldn't produce them fast enough
Okay.
for everybody.
Well, talking about the engine now, you on the Jenny, what is that, an OX5? You have it? What engine? do you have?
The Jenny had an OX5 in it, yeah. But it's notorious for not being very reliable, like a 50-hour TBO on it. So in order to fulfill our mission to educate people and move around the country and not have to truck the thing and take it apart and put it together, we as a group decided that it would be safer, for one thing, which, pilots are expendable.
Yeah.
But we put a General Motors engine in. It was back in that day, the Jenny was made to accept several different types of engines. The OX5 is V8 water cooled, 90 horsepower. So we built up basically a 383 stroker Chevy with a gear reduction on it. And so far it's been doing it. I think we got like 350 hours on the flying.
What did you think when you first cranked that engine up?
Which one?
This one right here.
This one hasn't been cranked here, but I had the film where the guy that built it cranked it before he shipped it to us to check it. It's awesome.
Where do you get a prop like that? I mean, you're not going to go down to Cincy and buy one.
Cinch did build this for us.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
We had the plans, and we met with them down there. And of course, they're a great supporter of vintage aviation. And they were challenged. They got their young engineers, and we got a picture of them all standing over a big set of plans trying to figure this thing out. So yeah, they did a good job for us.
Well, how about the paint scheme on the airplane? What does it represent?
Well, when they were delivered from Dayton Wright, they started in this scheme. So they didn't have the squadron markings, and they didn't have the numbers on them. They were basically green on the top for camouflage, so if you're looking from the sky, they'd blend in with the green foliage, or gray from beneath, so they'd go into the gray skies over Europe, I guess. So that's how it was delivered. And then when it was assigned to one of those squadrons, in this case the 50th Aero Squadron, all these young men, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, had mothers that liked to clean the sink with Dutch cleanser, the cleanest thing in the world. So they decided they would adapt that logo to clean the skies over France of all the Germans.
Got to wait till the tri-motor goes over here, man. Bob, let's jump 60 years ahead now, back over to the O2 here. Tell me about this particular airplane, where you got it, and the restoration of it.
Well, we were we're the second civilian owners. The first civilian owner, we did not know. He passed away and bequeathed it to an organization that we purchased it from. They just wanted to pass it through. So we were luckily in the right place at the right time. He had done some restoration. This airplane originally had a big rack of radios in the back that were used for all that communication. A big 400-pound rack of radios that had these things called tubes in them in many cases.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they didn't work very well back in the 60s. They were kind of obsolete. So those had all been taken out and modern military radios installed. So we decided, hey, there's no point in being so authentic, we go backward in time and put junk back in. So we use that space to carry stuff, but it still has all the radio communication capability it had back then, but with more modern military avionics. So we have VHF AM, VHF FM, UHF. It can be equipped with HF, but that's not really used very much, so we don't have that capability. And of course, now we have GPS, so we don't need the original ADF that it used to have back then. So it's so that takes care of the radio part of it. Everything else is relatively authentic, as best as we can get it, knocking on wood. We've added a couple of, well, we have all the pylons on it. We've added a camera port on the bottom, which was used for a Ka-18 strike camera to do reconnaissance of a battle damage assessment photography. So we have that camera. We didn't bring it. When you put that camera in, you have to take the right seat out, and we thought, well, maybe it would be nice to have a seat for whoever sits on the right side, whether it's my wife or I, depending on who's flying it. And all the antennas are as it should have been. We don't have original armament that did not carry bombs like that. Those are there just because, okay? It normally would carry rocket launchers, much like the A-26 that was here a while ago. It had rocket launchers and grenade launchers, both of which were standard armament on the O2, and a couple of different grenade launchers, flare launchers, and various other things. But it didn't really carry bombs. But that's poetic license, if you will.
Okay, well, you've flown and owned a number of airplanes, helicopters. How does this airplane fly compared to some of your airplanes?
Oh, it's beautiful. It flies like a big Cessna. As you would expect a plane that Cessna designed for businessmen to fly. It flies like a big, heavy 182. It's very well mannered, very stable. It's just a great cross-country platform. And yet, if you want to muscle it around, you can maneuver it. It's a real honest airplane. Like I say, it flies like a big Cessna, and that's exactly what it is. It is, however, not a single-engine airplane with an extra engine. And a lot of people see that it has sort of conventional look. It's got a motor in the front. Hey, it's a big single-engine plane with an extra engine. One of the common questions is, do you use both engines? And the answer is, of course, yes. It's a multi-engine airplane because it needs two engines to fly. It's a heavy airplane, 4,800 pounds max gross. It's comparable to the Piper Seneca, which is what Cessna designed it to compete with in the business market. And then the Air Force added drag and weight, but they didn't add more power, so it needs both engines to
It's
fly.
kind of strange that they would add all this, but they would also say, well, the gross weight's 1,000 pounds more now.
Yeah, well, they kind of, and sometimes they would push it more than that. There are apocryphal stories of the airplane being loaded up with fuel, loaded up with ordnance, and loaded up with stuff inside, practically until the tires were mashed flat. And a young lieutenant would come out and see the plane and say, "Why, sir, that's over gross, and go fly the airplane." Which they did, and it flew successfully, and you just kind of push all the levers forward, go fly, and bring it back.
Those of us that were military pilots at junior, you just did what you were told.
Exactly.
If they told you to do it, it must have been okay.
Exactly, and they did that day after day after day, so it worked okay.
And probably still do.
Yeah,
Okay,
still
I want to thank all you folks for coming with us, spending the time, and thank you guys. I learned a lot here.
On the 1st of October 1942, At the north end of what we now know as Edwards Air Force Base, a covert aircraft sat inconspicuously, its true nature concealed by a fake propeller, lest any curious observers question its design. In a momentous event, it embarked on its inaugural short journey across the desert lake bed, introducing a novel sound to the Mojave Desert and the entire United States. This aircraft was the Bell XP-59A, the very first American jet. The pressing question lingered. Would it be prepared in time to exert a significant influence on the outcome of World War II? The National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution stands as the most frequented museum worldwide. Within its exhibits, it houses some of the most pivotal aircraft and spacecraft in the annals of history, representing the tireless efforts of men and women who have expanded the horizons of aviation. Among these treasures is the first of the Bell P-59 series, crafted with urgency and secrecy during the early years of America's involvement in World War II. It now graces the flight testing gallery of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The genesis of this endeavor can be traced back to a groundbreaking deal in which a jet engine initially designed in England was licensed for development by General Electric in the United States. The Bell Aircraft Company faced a daunting challenge, tasked with designing and constructing the airframe to harness the power of these revolutionary engines in just 6 months. These engines held the promise of a future marked by high-speed, high-altitude flight, rendering propellers obsolete and potentially bestowing a military advantage upon the Allies in their conflict with World War II adversaries. This is the saga of the Bell XP-59A and its profound impact on the narrative of aviation. Our tale commences in post-World War I England, where a young Frank Whittle's passion for airplanes propels him forward. Departing from traditional schooling, he embarks on an apprenticeship at Cranwell, the Royal Air Force College. His apprenticeship not only immerses him in the intricacies of aircraft engineering, but also unveils his innate talent. As he hones his engineering skills, Whittle delves into the theoretical aspects of his education. His seminal work, a 3-part scientific thesis titled Chemistry in the Service of the Royal Air Force, encompasses an extensive study of the atmosphere.
And I became fascinated by finding that at a height of 69,000 feet, the air density was exactly 1/16th of its sea level value. And that meant that it would be possible, theoretically, to fly 4 times as fast for the same drag as at sea level and get 4 times the lift. But unfortunately, I was rather depressed to realize that it also meant you need 4 times the power. And piston engines wouldn't even turn themselves over at 40,000 feet.
Later he thinks of putting a piston engine inside a hollow fuselage driving a fan. He rejects the idea, but not completely.
And then I suddenly thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away and substitute a turbine and boost the pressure of the fan? And that was it. That was the turbojet engine.
But there is no interest in the idea. Whittle is now a pilot, known as something of a daredevil. One notable incident during his journey involved a rather harrowing experience when his rear-seat passenger unexpectedly tumbled out during takeoff. Whittle's quick thinking and skillful maneuvering allowed him to land the aircraft with the passenger clinging precariously to the tail. Amidst these adventures, Whittle remained steadfast in his dedication to advancing the concept of the jet engine.
My brother officers were rather amused by the whole thing. It was known as Whittle's Flaming Touch Hole.
It was an astute fellow officer who recognized the potential and advised Whittle to secure a patent for his innovative idea, leading him to do just that.
And then shortly after that, he was sent to Cambridge for advanced engineering work because he'd shown a lot of engineering ability. And in fact, he was brought up in his dad ran a machine shop, and he was mechanically inclined and a good engineer, basically.
In 1935, while pursuing studies at Cambridge, an old colleague offered his support in securing funding for the development of the jet engine. After months of tenacious effort, they achieved success.
And then in 1937, he formed his own little company, Power Jets Limited. Somebody put up about 10,000 pounds of capital, and he formed his company, even though he was still in uniform. and they let him work part-time on it.
Whittle established the headquarters of Power Jets in the quaint English village of Lutterworth, where he initiated the construction of his inaugural jet engine. After an intensive 7-year period of development and Whittle's relentless dedication, the jet engine was finally on the brink of becoming a tangible reality. By April 1937, it stood ready for crucial testing.
No one believed it would run at all. Didn't think it would even turn itself over. And quite a few people were gathered around to see me make a fool of myself. I was on the controls, and I gave the signal to turn the engine over with the big electric motor we had.
The following account is a reenactment captured on film depicting the events that transpired at Power Jets on the fateful day of April 12, 1937. Initially, all seemed to proceed as expected during the testing phase. However, an unexpected occurrence disrupted the proceedings, resulting in uncontrolled acceleration of the engine.
It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. It still accelerated. That was a terrifying thing. I knew that it was going to work, but my impression from that first test is that we had a long way to go.
The issue causing this acceleration was eventually rectified, but at that juncture, Whittle faced an impending transfer to a different location, potentially taking him away from the engine development work he had devoted so much of his life to. He ran a demonstration for his commanding officers.
The engine ran at least well enough to let the powers that be continue on the job. I was excused my promotion examination to squadron leader and promoted to squadron leader, and placed on the special duty list to continue the work.
In 1938, the director of scientific research, who was sceptical about the engine, came to Lutterworth to see it run. It had now been completely rebuilt twice.
Well, I ran it for 20 minutes at near full speed, and he was at last converted, decided that we did have an aero engine, practical air, basis of a practical aero engine, and agreed that a flight engine should be ordered and an experimental aeroplane to test it.
But the world was changing rapidly. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy unleashed a devastating wave of attacks in northern Europe, thrusting the continent into the throes of war. The long-anticipated conflict had become a harsh reality, catching many nations, including Britain, unprepared for the turmoil that lay ahead. In the early months of 1940, the Whittle W1 engine began to emerge as a potential game-changer in the military's eyes, a possible key to victory in the war. However, its full recognition and acceptance were still a distant goal. During this period, Britain's aerial defence against the formidable German Luftwaffe relied on the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire fighters, which performed admirably but were closely matched by the German Messerschmitts in terms of performance. What Britain needed was a weapon capable of flying at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour and ascending to altitudes above 40,000 feet. By April 1941, the Gloucester-Whittle E-28 had undergone successful taxi tests, with the inventor himself, Frank Whittle, occupying the cockpit for some of these trials. Nevertheless, even at this stage, official interest in the engine's first flight remained somewhat muted.
Certainly no important official had turned up to see that first flight, and they refused our request for an official photographer. And such rather poor film that exists was done by a handheld camera of someone from the Gloucester Aircraft Company.
On May 15th, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Sayer took the reins in the cockpit.
We went to the end of the runway, and we stood about a couple of hundred yards along by the side of the runway, and then he took off. It was quite unsensational. He took off beautifully, and He left the ground in about 600 yards, disappeared into the clouds, and we didn't see him for about 15 minutes, and we could hear him.
Embarking on a historic flight that proved to be a resounding success. Despite this triumph, the engine's full potential still eluded recognition. A peculiar turn of events transpired.
Our priority was taken away because they said everything must go into Spitfires and Hurricanes and so forth.
Leaving Whittle deeply disheartened. He earnestly desired for the engine to be taken to a secure location for further development.
Hap Arnold, the US Air Force general, got wind of it, you see, and he made a deal with the ministry.
They sent word over to General Arnold that they had a project that could conceivably affect the outcome of the war, and asked him to send a technical team over to evaluate it.
Fortunately, an evaluation of the engine yielded positive results, offering a glimmer of hope for the breakthrough that Whittle and his revolutionary jet engine had been striving for. In great secrecy, details of the engine were passed on to General Electric, with the object of building a test model and then producing the engine in America. General Electric was selected for its expertise in turbines, a technology closely aligned with the requirements of Whittle's jet engine. GE accepted this mission and embarked on a highly classified operation, taking delivery of a Whittle engine as the basis for their own production version. Secrecy remained paramount in their efforts. Simultaneously, Bell Aircraft established an isolated unit, shrouded in secrecy, tasked with the construction of America's inaugural jet aircraft.
Bell was selected as the contractor to build the airplane, because they'd shown a lot of innovative capability, and they had the capacity to take it on. The other builders of fighter airplanes were really loaded to the gills. And another reason for giving it to Bell was because Larry Bell was there to personally ride herd on the program.
However, on December 7th, 1941, the landscape shifted dramatically as Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor propelled the United States into World War II. Within General Electric, a secure unit was established to test the completed engine, aptly named for the confidential nature of its work. To further safeguard the project, engine manufacturing was decentralized, with various engine components assigned fictitious part numbers and produced at different locations within the factory. The GE workers remained unaware that they were contributing to the creation of America's first jet engine, with final assembly being the only step carried out behind closed doors. The outcome of this clandestine effort was the General Electric Type 1A engine, engineered to generate 1,250 pounds of thrust. Meanwhile, Bell Aircraft grappled with the formidable task of developing a new jet aircraft from the ground up in an astonishingly brief period of 6 months. Given its top-secret status, they couldn't even utilize government wind tunnels for testing. The design was ratified after the production of a single model, and manufacturing commenced on the production floor. As another secrecy measure, Bell's jet was given a misleading designation. Bell had abandoned a project for a piston-engine fighter called the P-59. The new jet was to be called the XP-59A. The setting is Edwards Air Force Base, situated in the Mojave Desert just north of Los Angeles. Today it serves as the epicenter of Air Force flight testing, harboring some of the most classified test projects. However, in the year 1942, it was nothing more than an expanse of barren desert.
The site was perfect for testing a top-secret aircraft because it was so far away from everything. The lake bed was the other major factor, because it provided a vast expanse of runway in any possible direction. In case an airplane, in this case a jet airplane, as with the P-59, flamed out, the pilot could make a dead-stick landing from almost any position around the lake bed. When the decision was made to locate the P-59 test program here at Muroc, there was nothing here in terms of test support facilities. And the need for security, this was, after all, a top-secret program, dictated that the test site should be at some distance from the training base that existed here at that time. For that reason, they selected a site on the north shore of the lake bed.
When Bell's chief test pilot, Bob Stanley, arrived at Muroc Dry Lake to prepare for the covert jet tests, he had very little to start with.
The barrack was more or less completed. The water tower was completed. The hangar was not completed. It was a portable hangar which had lost a few of its parts along the way. And when Bob Stanley arrived, the place was a top secret site. They had to get rid of the construction crew. So Bob Stanley had to oversee the final construction of the hangar and the barrack. Now this included, among other things, all the electrical system. And Bob Stanley had quite a reputation amongst his fellow workers as being, first of all, a brilliant engineer, very fine test pilot, very hard-driving man, difficult man to work for, but brilliant. He seemed to know a little bit about everything.
In mid-September 1942, the inaugural Bell XP-59A made its way to Muroc. This remarkable aircraft had been transported discreetly by train from Buffalo, meticulously wrapped to safeguard its secrecy. It was subsequently offloaded, transported the final few miles to North Base, and painstakingly assembled. The team assembled at North Base consisted of representatives from Bell Aircraft, General Electric, and the Army Air Forces. Before the month's end, Bob Stanley's assessment indicated that the engines could be ignited for their initial tests within the aircraft. The realm of jet propulsion was so nascent that they resorted to applying paint strips on the fuselage near the jet exhaust to examine the impact of heating on the airplane's skin. Crew members were uncertain about the safe proximity to the jet exhaust and wondered about potential risks. They discovered that the airplane's skin could withstand the heat. And with caution, being in the vicinity of jets was not significantly different from working with conventional aircraft. The engineers from General Electric observed with apprehension, dealing with temperatures far higher than those found in piston engines, with the pressing need to ensure the durability of these new jet engines. By the close of September, Bob Stanley had executed a series of taxi tests, all of which yielded satisfactory results. Now he was on the brink of witnessing how America's inaugural jet aircraft would perform when it took to the skies. Early on the morning of October 1st, 1942, the XP-59A was wheeled out of the hangar for its first flight. The plan was cautious. The initial foray into the skies would be a low-altitude hop, and if it proceeded smoothly, Bob Stanley would undertake subsequent flights at higher speeds and altitudes. In some respects, the cockpit layout of the new jet aircraft was simpler compared to that of a piston-engine plane. It featured fewer instruments to monitor engine performance. On the left side of the cockpit, 2 throttles were positioned, one for each engine. As Bob Stanley settled into the cockpit of the XP-59A on that October morning in 1942, he could hardly fathom the far-reaching impact that jet engines would soon have on global aviation. His focus was squarely on the upcoming minutes, navigating an untested aircraft. For the inaugural hop, the maximum altitude reached was a mere 25 feet, and the landing gear remained deployed. The following day, the altitude was raised, piquing the curiosity of those at South Base.
The combustion on this first engine was not very good, so there's heavy black smoke trailing behind it. It was particularly noticeable if you happened to be looking up the column from the back. From the side, you could see it, but if you were looking up that column, it really looked bad. And Bob hadn't been in the air more than 2 or 3 minutes, and the telephone rang. We got a call from the South Base. And this excited voice said, do you want some help? Can you send the fire people up? Walt said, no, what do you mean? Well, you got an airplane on fire. And And he realized what it was. No, I think we can handle it all right. So then the guys, and they knew we had a bunch of nuts up north if they took an airplane on fire that carelessly.
With these minor exceptions, the flights of October 2nd, 1942 were deemed successful. Bob Stanley completed 4 of them, ascending to a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. Astonishingly, after just 3 hours of engine run time, the flight test program was temporarily halted.
And then we were running into a 3-hour limitation that GE imposed so they could, because of course the engine was far more experimental than the airframe. And after 3 hours of running, it's run-up time, taxi time, flight time. They insisted they must pull the engines out of the airplane, partially disassemble them, and inspect key parts for the effect of temperature and wear, which is all very, very logical.
Despite the relative isolation of North Base in Muroc, it wasn't entirely secure, as a nearby road led from the small town of Boron down to South Base.
With a road running by about just half a mile away from us in that clear desert air, a lot of mechanics lived at Boron, working down at the South Base, so they were going back and forth every day. Some of those individuals were bound to be propeller-oriented, and they were going to notice that there was no prop on this airplane, so we rigged up a little round ring with 4 balsa wood blades going out in 4 directions. So whenever the airplane sat outside the hangar, that was just stuck on the nose, so that anybody half a mile away, it took care of that emergency before it arose.
By the time the engines were ready for further testing, Muroc Dry Lake had become inundated, prompting a temporary shift of the testing program to drier ground. Again, the phony propellers were brought into service. The honor of making the first test flight for the military fell to Lawrence Craigie almost by default. 2 other pilots who would have preceded him were overseas at the time.
I did it more just in a normal matter of course, because I'd been living with the program all year, and was very close to all aspects of it. So with Swafford and Kern in England, it was the most natural thing in the world for me to be out there and be bossing the program from the Air Corps side.
Half a century later, his recollections are vivid.
In an ordinary airplane with a piston engine, the moment of takeoff is the moment of maximum vibration. And with this rotary device, and only operating at half power, it was very, very smooth. So when we broke ground and took off, it was just amazing, that feeling of quiet. So that was the impression I've always carried with me of that first flight. It was accentuated, of course, by the fact that we were only operating at half power. Again, GE's conservatism.
General Electric's specifications had initially promised 1,250 pounds of thrust per engine, totaling 2,500 pounds for both engines. However, it soon became evident to those who piloted the XP-59A that the engines were falling far short of delivering the anticipated power.
We were a little bit concerned. We thought they were being a little over-conservative. We wanted to know just how much thrust we were getting, so Bob Stanley had him stick a metal fence post in the lake bed. We got a big spring scale. We attached it between the fence post and the airplane. We revved the engines up as high as GE would let us go. And we got a reading of 1,600 pounds on that spring scale. So we were getting 800 pounds of thrust per engine, which not a hell of a lot.
The deficiency in engine performance began to pose a significant challenge, as the engines were producing barely more than half of the promised thrust. This lack of power translated directly into reduced performance capabilities for the aircraft. Despite these setbacks, the covert flight test program pressed on, operating out of South Base at Muroc Dry Lake. With new pilots joining the ranks and additional flights taking place, maintaining secrecy became increasingly challenging as inquisitive eyes drew nearer.
One of the gunnery students, the South Base, happened to be just taken off, and he saw a P-59 taking off up north, and he noticed this heavy cloud shadow on the lake bed following it, which got his attention. Of course, it was from this cloud of smoke behind the exhaust. And then as the airplane got in the air, he decided he was going to get a look at it in spite of the instructions he'd had, leave it alone. So he maneuvered his airplane so that he got pretty close to it up in the air, and he saw it had no prop. Then he got all excited, and when he landed, he told all of his buddies back there that he'd solved the mystery, that that airplane didn't have a propeller. And they literally laughed him out of it, because it wasn't possible for an airplane to fly without a prop.
These new jet engines were very temperamental. It was a totally new technology. And the early engines were subject to flameouts, frequent flameouts. There was no way to restart the engines in flight. And hence, if you lost your engines, you needed a place to land and land quickly. The lake bed offered this opportunity to land in any direction, as long as you were flying within the vicinity of it.
It became evident that it was a very short-range affair, and this is where that unlimited expanse of lake bed paid off up there, because they thought nothing of just running a test until they ran out of gas. Stop, and they'd make a dead stick landing. In other words, just come in and land on the lake bed. They did this several times. Although it was not a dangerous airplane to fly, its handling characteristics were perfectly satisfactory, but it wasn't really a stable airplane, and it didn't come up to the performance handling qualities of an airplane like the P-38, the P-51, or the P-47.
The XP-59A encountered numerous minor issues, some of which were particularly discomforting in the scorching desert heat.
Temperatures in the cockpit were very high, and the reason for it was that the Bell had designed a double glass canopy with provisions to pipe hot gas from the engine compartment up in there to de-ice the winter and to keep it from frosting over. But the valve, which was supposed to be able to control it, wasn't functioning properly, so whether they wanted it or not, the hot air was coming through there all the time.
Tex Johnston, a test pilot at Bell Aircraft, was tasked with conducting altitude tests.
I was testing the airplane stability and control performance in 5,000-foot increments up to ceiling altitude. And everything was going well. And when the Wright Field back at Dayton, the Air Force, got the data from the 30,000-foot flight, which has made propeller airplanes obsolete, you know, they said, go immediately to the ceiling. And I got to 46,000 feet, and the rate of climb was, I estimated, down to just 100, maybe 100, 150 feet a minute. So I said, that's it, that's the altitude, and that's 46,600 feet. And I stabilized out and recorded the data. And then I pulled the throttles back to start the let down, pulled them clear back to idle, and they still ran at full bore. And I could drop the nose just a few degrees, and I'd get into high-speed buffet. I'd pull it up and go a little bit too slow, and I'd get a low-speed buffet, which is stall warning, high-speed stall, low-speed stall. And of course, I could only estimate this, but from my experience, I knew that I had about a spread of about 35 miles an hour between high-speed stall and low-speed stall.
In response to these challenges, Tex devised a solution, temporarily disabling one of the engines, ensuring that it didn't affect the hydraulic systems.
With the one engine shut down, it decreased the thrust 50% so I can let down, and I was in high-speed buffet all the way until I got down to about 35,000 feet.
Few individuals were privy to the existence of the aircraft, but those in the know were eager to experience flight in this groundbreaking machine.
In the portion of the nose the airplane that would house the armament section, the guns and ammunition and so forth, they installed a little cockpit just for an observer. And I've always felt that the primary reason for that really was to let Larry Bell fly in his airplane. But of course, it meant so much to him personally that his company had produced the first jet in this side of the world.
Larry Bell, the founder of Bell Aircraft, fulfilled his ambition by occupying the exterior cockpit and becoming one of the world's very first jet passengers. You can spot his flying helmet peeking above the front of the fuselage. Larry Bell was just one of several VIPs who were profoundly impressed by their flights in the aircraft's unique jump seat. Tex Johnston received the honor of taking a dignitary from Washington on a flight, and he chose a route along the highway to Boron for this significant journey.
And so I took him down this highway at full bore, right about 10 feet off the deck, so he looked up the telephone poles. And when they came back and landed, he got out and he said, "God damn, this son of a bitch went down the road, and the telephone line looked like a picket fence."
Performance on flight tests wasn't the leap forward that had been hoped for.
I guess we really weren't disappointed until we got well into the program, when we realized that it just wasn't shaping up. We didn't begin to appreciate in the early days what a tremendous breakthrough it was going to be.
But on the other side of the Atlantic and the other side of the war, the potential of the jet had already been recognized. The world witnessed the first flight of the German Heinkel HE-178, the inaugural jet airplane in 1939. However, the genuine German threat emerged from the Messerschmitt Company, and their jet fighter entered service in mid-1944. By late that year, Allied intelligence officers began detecting peculiar signs and unusual reconnaissance photos. In response, they turned to Frank Whittle, Britain's pioneering figure in jet propulsion, for assistance.
I saw the photographs and was able to help interpret them. And there were plain enough of the double scorch marks of a twin-engine jet.
These markings and images were the handiwork of the Messerschmitt Me 262, the most renowned and effective German jet aircraft of the war. As early as 1938, Messerschmitt had been tasked with submitting a design for a fighter aircraft powered by 2 turbojet engines. At that time, German jet technology was still in its nascent stages. When the Me 262 was ready to take flight in early 1941, the engines designed for it weren't yet prepared. Consequently, it made its inaugural flights using piston engines and only transitioned to jet power in July 1942. Pilots who had the opportunity to fly the Me 262 for the first time experienced a remarkable leap in performance compared to piston engine fighters. It exhibited superb handling characteristics and remarkable speed. However, the Me 262 didn't officially enter service until July 1944, almost precisely 2 years after its maiden test flight. By that point, the war had taken a grim turn for Germany, and Allied air supremacy was so overwhelming that the limited number of Me 262s in combat could hardly alter the course of the war. The German Luftwaffe had not developed tactical strategies to fully exploit the Me 262's high-performance capabilities, and there was no comprehensive plan for its effective deployment. One of the intriguing what-if questions of World War II revolves around the possibility of the Me 262 being introduced into service earlier than it was. Would it have made a difference in the ultimate outcome of the war? It remains a tantalizing speculation and a subject of historical debate.
There were delays in that program, which are a little hard to explain later on, some of which were due to Hitler himself injecting himself into the program and decided that he wanted them to build bombers instead of fighters. So that delayed the program probably 6 months. Even so, they did succeed, even in spite of all the difficulties they had in Germany with the war going against them. They built 1,200 of those airplanes. And fortunately for the Allies, only 200 of them ever saw service.
In war-ridden Germany, it took a long time to develop the jet engine to operational standard, and there were other reasons for the delay.
They were the successful airplane. See, they had a logistic problem. They had pilot problems, and they had fuel problems, and they had logistic problems getting to use these airplanes, which is why they never used but 200 of the 1,200.
In the Mojave Desert in 1943, Bell Aircraft was having problems of its own and fulfilling the promise offered by jets as a weapon of war. There were now 3 prototypes of the Bell XP-59A under test. They had been developed in extreme secrecy and isolation without the benefit of normal design processes available to most advanced aviation projects in America. Even after months of flight testing in the desert, Bell and General Electric found themselves largely on their own, diligently refining the engine and airframe in relative isolation.
As the program developed, we wanted to give Bell some outside help. In fact, the normal thing in an experimental program would be for the airplane manufacturer to work with the NACA, utilize NACA's wind tunnels at Langley Field. But they were not allowed to do that. In fact, NACA knew nothing about this program. There probably weren't over a dozen or 15 individuals at Wright Field that knew of the existence of the program until long after the airplane flew.
In 1943, Larry Bell faced a challenge. He had been compelled to develop America's first jet aircraft secretly and address the inevitable teething problems that others could capitalize on in the future. Now, he needed to secure lasting benefits for his company. Even before the prototype had taken flight, Bell had received a production order for an additional 13 planes, designated as YP-59AEs for the Army Air Force's service trials. In 1943, as these planes became available, the initial impressions were confirmed. The potential of Bell's new jet as a game-changer or even a meaningful war participant was rather limited. In January 1944, the secrecy was finally unveiled, and it was publicly disclosed that America had a jet airplane. For months, the Bell Company had been striving to persuade the military to place a substantial order for the P-59. Back in mid-1943, Larry Bell had proposed to the Army Air Forces that they should order 300 of these airplanes. He spared no effort to convince both the Army and the Navy of the plane's value for the war effort. Bell's chief test pilot, Bob Stanley, conducted a series of demonstrations for military personnel. Only a handful of individuals had ever witnessed a jet aircraft in flight before. For nearly everyone present, it marked their first encounter with an aircraft devoid of propellers and the novel sound of a jet engine. However, despite the novelty of jet propulsion, it was unmistakably clear that the P-59 did not represent a significant advancement over the best Allied piston engine fighters. It couldn't justify a substantial production run. Eventually, the Army ordered 100 of them, but only around half that number would be manufactured. General Electric continued to develop the turbojet engine, fully aware of its promising future independent of the P-59's success or failure. For Bell, it was becoming evident that their first American jet was not going to be a resounding success. Other manufacturers were already nipping at Bell's heels. In early 1943, while Bell was still producing its 13 YP-59As, Lockheed had been invited to submit a design for a single-seat jet fighter. As the production run of P-59s commenced at the Bell factory in Buffalo, more and more military personnel came into contact with these aircraft daily. Nevertheless, it took a significant amount of time for the news of this transformative power to reach those still engaged in remote overseas battlefronts.
I didn't know a thing about it, and none of the pilots did. In fact, I recall when there was a magazine called Impact. It was an intelligence magazine that was circulated in the Air Force, and I remember sometime in 1944, toward the end, I saw a copy of it and had a picture of a P-80 in it. And I thought they were just, trying to fool somebody.
In England, development on the jet engine had been proceeding independently. A new airframe had been produced by the Gloucester Company. Powered by 2 jets, it was called the Gloucester Meteor, and its performance was very impressive. The Gloucester Meteor, which entered service late in World War II, possessed the speed necessary to chase and intercept the German V-1 flying bomb. British pilots devised a special technique to deal with this menace. While shooting down the V, one was hazardous for pilots who had to fly through the explosion. They discovered that if they positioned their Meteor's wingtip under the V-1, they could tip it off balance, causing it to fall out of the sky. As the war approached its conclusion in the United States, more and more young pilots began to experience the exhilaration of flying an aircraft without a propeller. 20 P-59As and 30 P-59Bs were put into service. However, they were not destined for combat or to have any direct impact on the war's outcome. Instead, they were employed to acquaint pilots with the handling and performance of jet aircraft.
The P-59 was sort of the first jet and a good one to transition into by people who had flown conventional airplanes. And that's more or less where it stayed. It never was built for a combat airplane. It was a very easy airplane to fly, a very pleasant one, but it didn't have striking performance. Very short-legged, could have used more fuel. You had to be careful with fuel control. The fuel controls were not adequate, and you stayed away from sudden bursts of the throttle because you might have a flame out.
Don Lopez, who had returned from service in China flying P-40 fighters, got his opportunity to fly a P-59.
I was very excited to get to fly a jet because there were very few of them. And I remember it had such a big wing, a tremendously big wing from fore and aft, a lot of chord. And it seemed like you were stepping down into a bathtub or something, into the cockpit. But when you started the engine, you just pushed the button and one engine started, then you pushed the other, and you could almost only tell it by the instruments. There was hardly any noise. And you had to give it almost full throttle to get it to taxi, to move. And when you lined it up with the runway then, and you didn't have to warm up or check your engine. If it's running, it's running. And you line up with the runway, give it full power and let go of the brakes, and hardly anything happened. Then you just gradually start moving down the runway. It felt sort of like you were being towed by an invisible tow plane. And it lifted in the air because it had a lot of lift with the big wing. And it handled all right. It wasn't terribly fast. It was maybe a little faster than a Mustang, but and you could only stay up about 30 minutes because it ran out of fuel. But just being a jet was very interesting. But it didn't handle that well like a real fighter.
Nevertheless, there was already a new U.S. jet aircraft in operation that resembled a genuine fighter and exceeded the capabilities of any American fighter to date. This aircraft, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, boasted remarkable performance and handling characteristics that surpassed the Bell P-59. Despite its rapid construction, with a prototype built in just 143 days and its first flight on January 8, 1944, the P-80 came too late to have any impact on the war.
At the end of the war, we had one P-80 in Italy and one P-80 in England as a morale factor for our pilots who were running into 262s. And what are we doing?
In 1946, the first national air races since the commencement of the war were held. Enormous crowds relished the opportunity to witness the remarkable advances in aviation that had occurred during the war years. The P-80 was one of these standout attractions, as it was both exciting to watch and to fly.
My first flight in the P-80, I literally felt when we got off the ground in the air as if I was literally 6 or 8 feet behind the airplane trying to catch up with it because it had that tremendous thrust.
I loved it. It handled very well, very maneuverable, very small, tight cockpit. You really felt like you were in a fighter. And it just was, you climbed at 380 miles an hour, which was about 180 miles an hour faster than the P-40 cruised. And it just was a great airplane. I liked it very much. You felt like you belonged in it when you first got in it.
Immediately following the war, captured German aircraft were flown into France as part of Operation Lusty. This included numerous Me-262s, although not all of them were recovered with complete success. These airplanes were then shipped to America and put through a testing program. Rochelet flew an Me-262.
Performance-wise, it was a great airplane. It had great flotation. You could land on unprepared runways. Oddly, it had a nose wheel brake as well as the main wheel brakes, where you could get it stopped in a hurry. It had great firepower, devastating firepower, with the 4 cannons in the nose. It had long range. The shortcomings were it had 20-hour engines. We'd have to change the engines after about 20 hours.
So in 4 years, since the XP-59A was rolled out in secret in the Mojave Desert, it had not achieved as much as other early jets. So what exactly does the Bell P-59 Aerocomet mean in the annals of aviation history?
Had the airplane been developed in the normal fashion, with all of the wind tunnels of NACA and all of the capabilities of NACA and the Air Force available to it, a lot of these things would have been discovered and would not have existed in the airplane. So it was not a successful military airplane, but it was the beginning. It was the first jet in this country, and Bell truly did a remarkable job under almost unbelievably difficult circumstances with security and the other hamstrings that they were subjected to.
Aviation's rich tapestry often weaves a what-if narrative, and one of its compelling what-ifs is the scenario where British authorities had embraced Frank Whittle's jet engine concept in the early 1930s, shortly after Whittle conceived the idea. As for Sir Frank Whittle himself, he possesses unwavering conviction in the response to that question.
Well, if the whole thing had been backed as early as it should have done, it might have been in service 5 years earlier. And Bonner Hain, the German jet engine man, he's publicly said 3 times that had the British government backed me, as it should have done, it might have stopped World War II.
Regardless of the ultimate veracity of his claims, there's no denying that Frank Whittle and his groundbreaking jet engine have left an indelible mark on the history of aviation. Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.